maybe this multi-generation reality is good, and maybe we should be thinking a little bit more about their vocation in the back half of life.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Alan T. Stanton, and we'll be talking about the content of his new book, The Gift of Small, Embracing Your Church's Vocation. Alan is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and he currently serves as a consulting fellow with the University of the Ozarks Thriving in Rural Ministry Initiative. He's also the author of a previous book, Reclaiming Rural, Building Thriving Rural Congregations. In this conversation, we're going to talk about several of the subjects in his new book, including a take that he has on the whole all growth is good growth assumption, sometimes phrased as all healthy things grow. He talks about it through the lens that we live in a culture that is economically driven and that this affects the way we look at growth in the church. We'll also talk about why small churches should be more nimble than our big church friends, but we often are not, and why that's the case and what we can do about it. We'll talk about the differences between a hierarchical leadership model that our big church friends need to use and what he calls a solar system model that is better in small churches. And we'll also talk about the importance of what is sometimes the dreaded parking lot meeting that takes place after the regular meeting, but how not to fear that anymore, but how to lean into it and get the most out of it. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with my final thoughts about one of my favorite takeaways from The Gift of Small and from this conversation, namely the difference between regular and episodic volunteers. Well, welcome, Alan, to the Church Lobby. It's good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, you wrote a book that I had the chance to read, and apparently I may have been the actual first person outside of your editor to read it. If that is that.
Yeah, you were like first or second to read it. I mean, even the people who reviewed it to do the nice endorsements, I don't think they got back to me quite as soon as you did. So,
oh, it's nice to know because I'm not always that quick on the turnaround. But of course, the title caught my attention right off the top. You probably heard it already in the intro, but it's The Gift of Small, Embracing Your Church's Vocation. So when I saw the title, The Gift of Small, that was the first thing that caught my attention because it's not the problems of the small church. It's not the challenges of the small church, which is often how small churches are approached, but the gift of small. And this is the second book you've written about small churches. The first was Reclaiming Rural, Building Thriving Rural Congregations. How did you come to this place where you're interested enough in the smaller church to actually at this point write two books about it?
Yeah, so my vocation is sort of a winding path, but it started, my interest in the small church and the rural church started when I was in seminary or graduating from college, really. And I was invited to apply for the scholarship at Duke University, which is called the Thriving Rural Communities Initiative. And they said that they would pay for my full MDiv program if I would agree to serve in a rural community for 5 years. And my first gut was like, no, I don't think I want to do that. And my second one was, seminary is expensive and I already have student loans. That practicality kind of won out on it. But when I got to Duke and I had accepted the scholarship and I was in this cohort, I really fell in love with the role of the rural church in rural places. And I realized that I'm very much a small town rural church person, even though I live in Memphis right now. I still work on rural initiatives. And so I fell in love with the small membership church. When I was a pastor, I loved the small membership church. And that first book, Reclaiming Rural, was kind of written as a response to what I heard a lot about, like rural churches were dying and rural churches didn't have a place of vitality. And so I thought, well, wait a minute, this isn't really quite true. And then when I had finished that book I finished writing right as COVID sort of started, and we were all in that weird period where we couldn't really leave the house and everyone was trying to figure out what it meant to work from home. And I kept hearing, okay, small churches are going to die. Small churches are never going to survive this. And small churches are on their way out. And I remember sitting there, it was like the Sunday after, right around Easter. Our small rural church had dropped off a bunch of Easter eggs in my lawn so that my then 3-year-old and almost 7-year-old now could have an Easter egg hunt. and still have that joy of Easter. And I thought, like, this only happens in a small membership church,
Yeah.
right? And so I just started thinking, like, what are all these things that the small church brings to the table that we often overlook? And if we're thinking about a world where we really desperately need connection, well, the small church has that. And what if we started looking at the peculiarities and what makes the small church unique rather than as something that needs to be fixed, and say, what can the rest of the wider church learn from this? And really embrace that, lived into it, and said, okay, well, maybe being a vital church is being a small church. And that was kind of the impetus. So a little bit of it was a little bit of frustration and a little bit of hope, right? Because I see the way we talk about small churches, but also I've always found small churches to be places of great discipleship, of great hospitality, of great hope. And yeah, they have some issues just like large churches do. But more often than not, I would rather be in those churches, and I wanted to kind of celebrate them a little bit and say, these are all the great ways that small membership churches are building disciples for the kingdom of God. So let's embrace that and celebrate it.
Yeah, yeah. I love that the approach in the book is not even fixing the problems of small church, but celebrating them. And it's not even just here's what's right in spite of our size, but here's what's right because of our size is really where you go. Let's jump into it. There's so much that we could cover, and we'll take at least one portion of it and do it in the bonus material as well. But let's from the beginning. And by the way, I did write the foreword for this book. I was asked to and was thrilled after reading it to be able to write the foreword to it. So you know that I like the book if I'm actually going to write the foreword to it. And
oh yeah, which we very much appreciated. So
yeah, you're very, very welcome. I'm really honored to do so. So you start out fairly early in the book with an interesting take on the whole all growth is good growth maxim, or all healthy things grow is another way that's often said. And what you actually lay out that I thought was fascinating is you walk us through how we live in an economically driven culture. And then you write this: our economic imagination shapes the way we think about success in the church, because we often conceive of success as being equal to more money, more profits, more services, more production. We tend to carry that idea of success to the work of the church. So I think that's a fascinating approach. And as soon as I read it, it was one of those aha moments of, yeah, of course, that's a big part of it. It's one of those things where I wish I'd, read your book before I wrote my most recent book, Desizing the Church, because I get into that a little bit in the book, but that specific take of, hey, we live, especially in the US, in a very economically driven culture. And that paradigm is so much a part of our drive and the way we perceive things that it's really kind of invisibly affected the church. Walk us through some of how that happens and why that's dangerous for us.
yeah, well, we're formed in a lot of different ways, and we're taught to think about the world in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that the church tries to do is to say, this is a way you should imagine the world, right? Like Paul talks about it as be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So you have this Richard Hayes as a New Testament, I would say New Testament theologian, and he likes to talk about the scriptural imagination, right? You want to have an imagination that's shaped by scripture. But the reality is our imaginations are shaped by so many different facets of our lives. And so if you're a doctor, you're going to approach the world sort of in this medical lens, and you're going to be looking at the community in a different way, right? Like if you have a doctor go analyze a community, they'll look at public health disparities, for instance. But the one thing that we constantly sort of thread throughout our cultural and societal narrative is economics. And our economics, I became fascinated with this book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And she talks about our images of economics are driving us to unsustainable things. And, growth is great. There's some things that we want to grow, but there's sometimes where we hit a point of growth and we say, wait, we can't really grow anymore without sacrificing who we are. And we have this, I'm working on our university strategic plan right now, in our college strategic plan. And there's moments where, like, we don't want to just say increase, we want to say get better, right? Like we want to, because we can increase to a point where we're not good anymore. And Raworth talks about it as sort of an ecosystem. So in every ecosystem, there's a balance of growth. And if things are growing too much, then it's actually cancerous. Like the cells if your body cells just keep growing past stasis, that's not a good thing. And I find that we take this kind of image of growth into the church where we're always like, well, is your church healthy? And what that becomes a stand-in for is your church growing or more people coming? But when people start coming to your church, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's generally a good thing, right? We want people in our community, but it also does change the fabric and the DNA of our congregations. We don't really wrestle with what that means sometimes. So we say like, oh, I want a bigger church, but you're actually sacrificing something by saying that, right? So it's not, I don't think it's as clear cut as saying a bigger church is a better church or a bigger church is a healthier church. Like growing for the sake of growth is not, I don't think, a good theological goal.
Yeah, I agree. I think because a lot of the growth conversation talks about scale. How do you scale up? And there are entire conferences and podcasts about how do we scale up. One, first of all, I challenge whether or not scaling up is important or necessary. But secondly, what we're talking about here is not really just a difference of scale. It's really a difference of type. When you go from the small to the large, it's not just the same, only bigger. And the small is not the same as the large, only smaller. They're different types of animals. They're different types of organizations. They structure in different ways.
Yeah.
The rules are different. Sometimes 180-degree opposite, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you think about like a small startup, and I bring some of this in the book. A small startup is going to behave very differently than an established institution. So you look at the way look at Google. I mean, and I don't know a ton about Google's corporate history, but look at the way they started back in the early 2000s, 90s, right? It was a very different organization, and everybody was required to take a day for like to do their own coding and side projects, right? And those were brought into the Google ecosystem, and some really cool products came out of it. Google would not do that now, right? Like
Right,
Google
right.
is still an innovative company, but like they're very top heavy. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
hierarchy of saying like you will do this and this is how we're going to perform. They have shareholder expectations. So they just behave differently. And I think, I mean, at least in my world, you've probably encountered this too with churches. You see things all the time of saying like, well, if we just have to like make the big church into a littler version and that'll be your leadership model, but it doesn't function the same. People don't interact at the same level. So when
No.
you're a pastor in a small church, you're really interacting with everyone in the congregation. Whereas if you're the pastor of a large church, there might be people that you never even meet. And you're really depending on other people to be in this. And when you start digging into organizational theories, like what we find is that volunteers engage large organizations and small organizations differently. And the programs that large organizations and small organizations offer are different. And like all these theories are sort of out there. And I thought it would be interesting to say, like, what if we apply these to the lens of the church, right? Because churches are still sociological organizations with organizational theories. So yeah, I just don't think it's easy enough to say like all churches can operate in the same way and all pastors have the same responsibilities. Like they just don't behave that way.
No, very, very different. When I teach this at conferences, one of the things I describe is the smaller the church is, the more the pastor's role is defined by their presence. And the bigger
Yeah.
the church gets, the more the pastor's role is defined by their absence. And these are 180-degree opposite ways of functioning. The bigger the church is, the pastor's not going to be present in the room. So how do we function in the pastor's absence? Whereas in a small church, the pastor's there all the time. So how do we have these interrelationships going on? So they're very, very different. Now, you get into some really practical things about the gift of small and the way small churches are different. And in chapter 3, entitled The Nimble Small Church, is really important. I want to talk about this a bit because in my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, I talked about how small churches are more like motorboats than cruise ships, that they're able to make changes really, really quickly, whereas you need a huge turning radius for a cruise ship. That makes sense, but most small church pastors, that has not been their experience.
Right.
So you tackle that directly. So what you say is you actually focus on what you call two organizational realities about the nimbleness of the small church, that and why the small church quite often is not as nimble as it ought to be. So let's walk through those two organizational realities. The first organizational reality you mentioned is this: church leaders need to recognize that people like the path of least resistance. So how is that a huge reality we need to be aware of if the church is not as nimble as it should be?
Yeah, this is one of those beautiful things that behavioral economics gave us. And that is people will always default to whatever choice is easiest to make, right? And it might actually be worse for them and it might be the harder path, but it just looks easier. It's easier to get into that funnel. And we see this everywhere. So, for instance, if you go to a restaurant by yourself you'll eat 30% less than you will if you go to a restaurant with your friends. Like
Mm.
that is just a reality of things, right? Because it's easier to eat more when people are around. If your employer offers you a retirement plan that you have to opt out of, you are way, way more likely to stay in that retirement plan than if you have to opt into it. You
Right.
probably won't get into it as fast, right? So people will take these sort of paths. And one of the things I wanted to think about was what are those paths of least resistance in the church, right? Parking lot meetings, I think, are a good one. If you think that you're going to get rid of a parking lot meeting, you're not.
Yeah.
Like you're, and those are the kind of the moments where people are like, our church can't change, but you can use the parking lot meeting to do something else, right? So you can use that.
I'm assuming that most pastors hearing this immediately are aware of what the
Oh
parking
yeah.
lot meeting means. But for those who might not catch on, define the parking lot meeting for us. How does that usually occur?
So the parking lot meeting is my favorite thing in the world, and it is after church or after a meeting, you've had a really good meeting, and you think you've arrived at some great decision, and everyone goes and stands in the parking lot, and they chat. You, as the pastor, are probably not in it. I've been in a couple of them as the pastor, but usually they start to disperse once I walk outside, right? And then the next day or a couple of days later, somebody comes up to you and says, "Well, we talked more about it,
Yeah.
after the meeting,
Hmm.
and we decided blank." Parking lot meetings drive pastors crazy because it's sort of this meeting that they're not part of. You're not going to get rid of it. It's one of those paths of least resistance. People have been doing this for years and years. It's just a natural human thing. We see it in like every kind of organization. I work in a university. We have hallway meetings all the time after a
Yeah.
meeting. So the question is not like, how do I get rid of this thing that sort of irks me that is immovable, but how do I make pathways where people can choose better options, right? Where they can choose to do things in a different route. And so sometimes that's, we need to tell a different story. We need to frame things differently. We need to think about like, what are the underlying sort of relational things at play? But you don't just have to stay stuck in like the thing, but you do have to recognize that people are going to stay in that path if they're already on that path.
Yeah. And that's part of what I love about the way you approach this in the book is quite often we're taught in some church leadership organizational structures how to push back against the small church tendencies like the parking lot meeting. And there's a tendency within us as pastors to go, no, that's not the designated place for this decision to be made. Whereas you go, hey, this is a reality of the small church. You can fight against it, but you're going to lose. So you might
Yeah.
as well adapt to it, understand it, and participate in it. And some of that, again, the path of least resistance, that's the first organizational reality. Before we forget it, let's get to the second organizational reality that we need to be aware of if our church is not feeling as nimble as it ought to be. And that is church leaders should remember that changes in deeply relational organizations impact the relationships themselves. And as a part of that, I believe you talk about the solar system model
Mhm.
of organization. So walk us through what that means.
Yeah, so John Cotter developed this solar system model, and this ties back a little bit when we talked about small organizations versus large organizations. Large organizations are a hierarchy. They're sort of top down. Solar system models, smaller organizations, you have something sort of at the center. So in this case, the pastor, and everything else is sort of in a solar system, right? Everything's sort of going out from the center. The pastor is interacting with all those components, and all those individual components are also interacting with each other. So when I teach this, for instance, I have a nice diagram where it has like the pastor, and then there's like a link off to like grumpy old person, and then there's a link to from the grumpy old person to like my grandmother started this church, right? And that
Right,
goes back
right.
to the pastor, and then there's like the energetic youth and the people that just showed up, and like all these different people. And so when you're trying to create change, you're actually trying to get people to create the change among themselves. You're not just saying like, here's the top down. So you're trying to say, what does this mean for us as an entity? And those are going to have another like a personal factor that we don't often consider. And I think I tell this story in the book, but like, if you go to a small membership church that's been around for decades and you say, I want to get rid of the baptismal font because it's ugly, right? Well, if my grandmother was baptized in that font and I
Mhm.
was baptized in that font, my mom was baptized in my font, my daughter was baptized in that font, you're not just saying to me, I want to get rid of this thing because it's ugly. You're not saying like this is just a piece of furniture. You're saying, I want to get rid of this thing that has articulated your family's faith for 4 generations,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to talk about that a little bit differently than we do, here's a piece of furniture, can we move it? It's not just a piece of furniture,
Yeah.
right? It's a symbol of our faithfulness and a symbol of my discipleship. So building those relationships and understanding that any change you make is going to have a relational component to it, I think is a key part of understanding how change happens. And if you can build those relationships and capitalize on them, you actually might be able to make the change faster. So if somebody comes up and says, this baptismal font is leaking from the bottom and it's, causing all these issues, I would be much more inclined to say, well, let me help you buy a new one so we can continue my family's legacy in this church, right? And so you can get what you want, and you can make the change that you want, but you're actually bringing people into the journey with you.
Yeah, I love that. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. In the book, you start out with these 2 organizational realities that we need to acknowledge if the church isn't staying nimble enough. You then get into 4 practices to help a church stay nimble. And I'm going to use this as a tease. We're not going to do this in the podcast, but we're going to do it in the bonus material. So if you are in a church that's having a hard time staying nimble and you want some practical help, first of all, you can just go out and buy the book, The Gift of Small, and it'll be all in there. Or you can get the bonus material that we'll have about 10 minutes on 4 practices to stay nimble. So if you want that, you can go to karlvaters.com/support and become a monthly supporter, and you can get all of the links to all of the bonus material that way. Or if you go to karlvaters.com/subscribe for free, you can get the weekly newsletter, and that will also have the link to all the bonus material. So in the bonus material, Alan and I will talk about the 4 practices to stay nimble that he outlines in the book. But for now, let's continue on, because you've got so much in this, and it's one of those where we could go a couple hours with it, but we're just going to give a little bit on each of these to folks as we go through them. Chapter 4 of the book is entitled Choosing Small. And in it, you say this: by focusing on becoming bigger, small membership churches can actually sacrifice the essence of who they are. That there are so many small church membership churches is not a testament to their failure to thrive. Rather, it's a testament to the fact that people enjoy participating in these congregations. And then you say, if all these small membership congregations disappeared, where would the people go who want that smaller, more intimate space in which to worship? So talk to us a little bit about who is it that's choosing to come to a small church, and what is it that they're looking for that we can then help them to find when they come to our small membership churches.
So a couple of anecdotes here. I remember as a small church pastor, I had these wonderful people that would show up at my church, and they had tried the down the street multi-campus, mega church, right? It was interesting. Somebody posted on my Facebook a few months ago, and they said, we went to that church, and they told me I couldn't keep my infant daughter with me in the service, right? I had to take them to the nursery. And she was like, and I was like, I'm not going back there, right? Like, you don't want my family here, right? For that person, it was very much like, I could not be my family here. People choose churches for different reasons. And this isn't anything about any knock at larger churches, but people want that sort of connection. They want that space where they are known and can be known. And so I'll give my own personal example. Like, we moved to Memphis. Memphis is a much larger city than I've ever lived in before. When we started finding a church to land, we immediately knew a couple of things. So, like, one, I'm clergy in the United Methodist Church, so we're probably going to end up in the United Methodist Church. But 2, we wanted a church where we could be known and know people. And so we ended up at this wonderful church, at Trinity United Methodist Church in Midtown. And, it's this wonderful place for every Sunday. Like, my daughters love going. They run around church. Everyone knows who they are. My youngest dances whenever there's a hymn, right? And she's at the back of the church dancing in the little corner. They go to children's church with Miss Irene. I mean, so it's this wonderful community of people. I would feel lost in a large membership church. I would feel like completely unplugged. I want a church that I can bring my full self to every day and people know me. And people are choosing that. people want that sort of generational connection. They want that like cross-cultural sector, like cross-economic sector connection. Like I'm going to church with people with different pay scales. I mean, there's all these different reasons that people are choosing these small membership churches. I don't think it's fair to say like everyone needs to go to a big church because some people just don't want that. And it's the same with, a lot of other things in life. Like people choose small colleges because they need that
Yeah.
connection in the classroom. Like they want smaller class sizes. People choose large colleges because they want a variety of programs. And that's just a kind of a feature of what we're doing. And the thing about small churches in particular is like once you grow out of being a small membership church, you can't be a small membership church anymore, right? Like you can't be a church of 2,000 and also have all the features of a small membership church. You've just grown out of it. And so a little bit of that is borrowed from some stuff in rural public policy where we talk about like there's not a good definition of what rural means, right? But we know that once you grow out of being rural, you become a metropolitan area. So like it's the only category that you can actually grow out of.
Yeah. So you were talking a little bit about the value of, there are people who can thrive in the small church and they can't necessarily thrive in the big church and vice versa. It reminds me, I believe it was Malcolm Gladwell in his book, David and Goliath, where he talks about, everybody wants to get into Harvard, everybody wants to get into an Ivy League college, but there is ample evidence to show that being in a mid-level college and doing well and performing well, near the top of your class in a mid-level college is far better for your emotional state and for your future prospects than being at the bottom of the class in Harvard.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily because you're smarter or not smarter. It's because your skill set, the way you learn, the kind of thing you want to do for a living, it may be more suited to a non-Ivy League college. And so the idea that Ivy League is always better is simply not shown to be verifiable by the stats. And I think the small and large church kind of follows along that way as well. Yes, there are aspects, technical excellence that can be offered by a big church, but there's an emotional connectivity that can be offered by the small church that the big church, as you already said, kind of grows out of and quite often tries to get back. In fact, I've done some consultation at multi-site. And at the multi-site that I was consulted at last year, the pastor called me and said, we've got the best of both worlds here. And my immediate response was, and you've also got the worst of both worlds.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And he paused and I could tell him like, what? Like he didn't know what that might even mean. I said, you never just get the best of both. With the best of both, you've got to take the worst of both. And I started walking through what the challenges were. And it was like, oh, I hadn't even seen that. But we get really myopic in our expectations and we think that this is going to solve all of our problems. We get rid of one set of problems and we buy a new set of problems when we get bigger or when we get smaller. And we've got to realize that. But I want to move along because we could go down to so many of these wonderful rabbit holes. But you spend an entire chapter 5, talking about the small aging congregations.
Yeah.
And this is the situation that a whole lot of our listeners find themselves in. And one of the things that surprised me very counterintuitively, as you said, there's a consistent myth that small membership churches are composed of mostly older adults. In this narrative, small churches are full of retirees, so there's little hope of the church surviving into the future. And then you say something that surprised me, so walk us through this. Fortunately, there is ample data to help bust these myths. What? Our small churches aren't just full of older adults ready to retire and the place is about to die. Walk us through some of that data, because that's really important, I think, for us to understand.
Yeah, so this was actually a fun one for me because it actually surprised me a little bit, both on the data side, which I won't dive into all the stats. If you want to read the stats, please pick up a copy of the book. There's a whole chapter of nothing but statistics. And it was a pain to edit. But okay, so one, when we talk about older adults are not some sort of like homogenous group. So you have people at various stages of life after retirement, and people live longer. You have people in their older adulthood who are recent retirees, and we say, okay, well, they're senior citizens. I'm like, sure, but they have high income still. They have high net worths, generally higher than like my generation. I'm 34 for context. They have more volunteer hours. They have a whole area of life that they want to explore after retiring, right? Because you've done a career, and now what's next in your vocation, right? So it's not just like, okay, well, you're done, you've retired, you're out of any sort of productivity or anything like that. Like, no, that's not true. So that's one thing, is like older adults is not just one category. It has multiple generations in that.
Yeah.
And then two, it is true that churches are getting older. That's true of all, like except for a few mega churches.
Yeah.
Like every religious group is getting older. That's just a fact. And so when I started diving into the data a little bit, it really, most small membership churches had less than, well, a lot of them had like a high number of older adults or recent retirees, but it wasn't this kind of stark, like 90% of small membership churches have 90% of their members above the age of 70. It
Right.
was really way more varied. And these are numbers I pulled from the National Congregation Survey, which is publicly available. You can go online, look at it.
Yeah.
And the church has sort of said we need younger churches. But to go back to economics, for instance, or political science, a lot of places have said actually these older adults who are moving to our areas are a really big boost and a really big boon. And so you've
Yeah.
seen whole communities pop up that are recent retiree communities, right? And I talk about Jimmy Buffett got in on this trend, right? Starting these communities in Florida of aged 55 or better. If you're a Buffett fan, you can go live in one of those communities. And they had hundreds of people lined up to buy
Yeah.
a house, right? In rural communities who are getting a lot of recent retirees, they're starting whole economic development programs centered around how to support recent retirees and their new entrepreneurship as they explore this back half of life.
Yeah.
And that in particular got me thinking like, okay, if religion is declining and small membership churches are all about relationships, like maybe this isn't something that we should be running away from. Maybe this multi-generation reality is good, and maybe we should be thinking a little bit more about their vocation in the back half of life, and instead of just saying like, okay, well, if you have an older church, you're done. So it's both not true that all these churches are just on the precipice of dying, and it's also not true that even if you have a majority of people who are recent retirees or older, that's a decline, right? Neither of those things is true. You can have a really vital, wonderful congregation that's active, that's full of retirees. They can replace themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to change our stereotype of the senior and the retiree. I'm old enough to have remembered an era in which retirement apartments, retirement centers, we just called it the home, and it was a place where you sent someone to die.
Yeah.
And if you've been in any of them recently, unless you are in a place where people are there for, palliative care and hospital care, but if you are in a typical retirement place, you are not talking about the home anymore. You're talking
No.
about very active people who have very vibrant social lives, who are looking forward to this season of their life and are looking for something to do and something that interests them and a way to be active, and are going to churches where they want to be active as well. So we
Yeah.
have to approach this in a completely different way. It's not the phrase that I remember pastors used to use. In fact, it was a pastor at a retirement center 30, 40 years ago who said, yeah, we got a lot of people who attend churches and retirement centers because they're cramming for the finals. And older membership churches are no longer just a bunch of people cramming for the finals, waiting for the embrace of death. They are active and vibrant, and we need to acknowledge that.
And there's some really cool things. And they're also playing pickleball all the time.
I know, it's huge. I want to play myself. It actually looks like a lot of fun. I haven't had a chance yet, though. Hey, I want to get into chapter 6 was maybe the thing that jumped out at me the most. And because it was one of those things where when I read it, I went, oh, yeah, you were able to give words to a phenomenon that until you gave it words, I hadn't noticed, which is this. Broadly speaking, there are two categories of volunteers at churches in general: regular and episodic. And I'd never put it this way, but the way you line it out is, I'll try to define it and you tell me how close I
Yeah.
am, and you add to it. The regular volunteer is someone who maybe oversees a department. They're there on a weekly basis. You rely on them consistently. And in the big church, you hire the regular worker, someone
Yeah.
who has been trained to oversee the youth group, to run the worship team, to oversee whatever department it is. But in the small church, that regular volunteer who's overseeing things is learning as they go. They weren't trained in that. And so in the
Right.
big church, you've got hired people who do the regular jobs, and they bring volunteers in for the episodic, which is maybe once or twice a year I'll show up when we need a few extra people. But in the small church, it's volunteers doing both the regular and the episodic. So walk us through, first of all, did I define that correctly from what I read in the book? And secondly, how does that change the way we approach volunteerism in the small church compared to the big church?
You got it right as far as I understand it. So
Okay, got it.
if you defined it wrong, then I've also
Then
defined
we're
it
both
wrong.
wrong. Okay, as long as
Yeah,
we're both wrong, I'm happy.
as long as we're both wrong, right? Yeah. So when we think about volunteers in large churches, people show up for these kind of one-off events, right? As you said. And in the smaller churches, most people, we have higher per capita rates of volunteering, but they tend to be these regular volunteers. So they're not going to show up for a program. They're going to show up to fold bulletins. They're going to take care of the nursery, right? They're going to be the choir director. So they're going to have all these sort of responsibilities that keep the place running. And so I think for large churches, there's a really big question of how do we make sure that those episodic volunteers are plugged into the life of the congregation in a discipling way? That's a really great question that somebody should answer, not me. But then for smaller churches, right, we know a couple of things about these volunteers. So one, they tend to be more committed. So they are actually helping your church run itself, right? Without them, the church would stop. They tend to be less concerned about like the enjoyment of the task and more focused on the community of the people that they're spending time with. So they're coming as partially social, and they tend to have very strong opinions about the nature of the organization they're volunteering in, which would surprise no one that, the nice people in the kitchen have strong opinions about the church, right?
Yeah.
Like you want to hear some pointed conversations, go to a
Oh,
church
yeah.
kitchen,
Yep.
like the night before a potluck dinner, right? Like people are, whoo, buddy, it's great. And so that raises another question for pastors and leaders of small churches, I think, which is one, if people are engaging in this way, how do we make these sort of engagements also spiritually formational? If you're balancing the books, how do we use that as a discipleship formational opportunity, right? How do we take service of the nursery as a spiritual formation opportunity? So there's kind of and some of this goes like just regular committee work, right? Like how do we turn a trustee committee into something that's spiritually developmental? But the other reality too is if people are spending all their time as regular volunteers and they are keeping the church going, when we ask them to start also doing episodic volunteering, we're asking them to burn out. And we're starting to ask way too much. And so it can't just be programs that are the discipleship. It has to be how do we build the discipleship into every facet of the congregational life together, not just, and also we're going to throw this block party on Saturday for all the neighborhood kids, right? It can't just be like some kind of superfluous thing.
Yeah, that to me was one of the real insightful parts that I will go back to and that I will, use in my teaching of others with full credit to you for that, because that distinction is something I hadn't noticed before, but is again, as we talked about earlier, not just a difference of scale between the big and small, but a difference of type.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference that we need to acknowledge.
And, it's very different. Like, so I'm what we call an extension pastor, right? So I am ordained, but I serve outside of the church and I go to church. And so I feel like I have a commitment to my congregation that I go to. I also have two kids. I get to work at 8 a.m. I leave work at 5 p.m. I go get my kids. And then I have my regular responsibilities in the life of the church, right? Which in my previous church would sometimes be like I would preach regularly or I would work with the youth group all the time. If somebody said to me, you need to come to one more event, I would say no. Like I want to go spend Saturday with my daughter, right? Like I want to spend time with my kids. I want to take them to the zoo. I want to go for a hike, because you're going to end up burning me out otherwise. And so just thinking about like the way people engage in our congregations, I think is really important, particularly in the small church where everything is really going to be relational.
Yeah, I agree. And there's so much more we could get into. You talk about the difference between career and vocation from the subtitle of the book. Talk about the importance of embracing story. But I just encourage people to pick up the book, The Gift of Small, and get that for yourself because we're getting short on time. So we're going to get into the lightning round. And then I encourage you to come back also later for the bonus material in which we will be talking about 4 practices to help your church stay nimble if you're having a hard time with that in your congregation. So lightning round first. Here we go. What are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to it?
Oh gosh, I am really actually excited because I think people are starting to care more about small membership churches and rural churches. Whereas when I started, I remember people saying to me, you're going to ruin your career by going to a small membership rural church. Now it's sort of seen as like, okay, and some of this is COVID and sociological, right? Like we realize, okay, actually we need connection. Go figure. So the fact that people are really caring about rural churches and small membership churches, and I am just so excited. So that's probably the biggest thing.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen that wonderful shift as well. Secondly, what free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you'd recommend for small church ministry?
Oh gosh, a free resource. So I'm going to give a plug to the University of the Ozarks. We work with pastors and you can email us. We don't have an app or a website yet, but we're working on it and it'll be out
All right.
soon. And we want to work with small membership rural churches, so please give us a call anytime. And that is at the University of the Ozarks in Clarksville, Arkansas. And then, a free resource. If you haven't ever used, this is a little bit like when we think about the mission of the church and the community support of the church. If you've never used 211, it's run by United Way, and it's all across the U.S. You can find the data for your specific area, and you can actually find out what resources people are requesting all over your community. So you can go in by zip code and say, the people in my zip code have really been requesting resources for housing or resources for food. And
Oh,
usually it's 211counts.org, and you can kind of find your area and your state from there. And so I often send pastors there when they're trying to figure out like what's going on in my community, right? 211. It's great.
211counts.org.
Yep.
We'll put that link to that in the show notes. I have not heard of that. I'll check that out myself.
And each state has a little bit different one, but it's
Yeah. No, I love the idea that there's help out there already to discover where the needs are. What are some needs we might be able to step in and meet? That's fantastic. Thirdly, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
oh, I actually share it in this book. Well, I'll do two. I'm going to cheat. So
Sure.
one by the same person, one person told me one time, every interaction you have as a pastor is a moment of pastoral care. And I thought that was just really profound. And I didn't understand it right away because I thought like I'm going to be doing therapy in a hallway and I'm not. Right. But
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was one of the pieces of advice that stuck with me as I was writing this book. And I mentioned it here because those relationships are so important. And then the same pastor told me once, the key to doing good pastoral care is knowing when to use the appropriately placed cuss word. So
Wow. Okay. That almost matches as an answer for the final question, which
oh
is what's
gosh.
the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
Oh man. This is the great thing about small membership churches, right? Because you just never know what's going to happen. I'm going to cheat again and do two. And so one is like a couple of weeks ago in church, this little kid who is a friend of my youngest daughter. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. And the little kid in the middle of the children's sermon raises his hand and the pastor calls him and he goes, Pastor, I just tooted, like right into the mic. And his
Yep.
mom sits on my row and she was, horribly embarrassed. But the other thing that happened a lot when I was a small church pastor is we would have this wonderful elderly lady. And this was really her only social event of the week was coming to church. And as we were starting the service about once a quarter, she would stand up. And I mean, like, as I'm doing the call to worship, right? She would stand up and she would say, Hey, I would like to play a song on the piano. And one time it was a Hank Williams song. And I
Wow.
thought that was the most hilarious thing I'd seen at that point.
Yeah, yeah, that was a fairly common thing way more years ago. It's still quite common in a lot of small rural churches today, but it was really common across the board where people just came in and expected at any point they could just get up and do whatever they wanted. I just
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, yeah, love it. Hey, if people want to follow up on any of this, and obviously in addition to picking up the book, The Gift of Small, how can they find you online or follow up on anything?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. Well, not Twitter anymore, X, Threads. I think I have the same username for all those, A Stanton or AT Stanton. And I say this all the time. If you're in a small church or in a rural church, like either of those, and I'm not saying that all small churches are rural churches, right? But I always put this offer out and no one ever takes me up on it. But please shoot me an email and I would love to hear your stories. And if I can be a resource to you, I want to be a resource to you. So feel free to send me an email, astanton@ozarks.edu, and I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody. So
Terrific. All of that will be in the show notes for everybody when they need it. So we are going to go into the 4 practices to help your church stay nimble in the bonus content. So again, if you are not yet subscribed, there are 2 ways to get the bonus content. Go to karlvaters.com/support, become a monthly supporter and get all of the links. Or for free, you can get it at karlvaters.com/subscribe, get the free weekly newsletter, get all the links to all the bonus content, including the bonus content that Alan and I will be walking through on 4 practices. Well, my biggest takeaway from Alan's book, as I mentioned in the interview, was the difference between regular and episodic volunteers. So here's my additional thought about that. It's really easy in small churches to get frustrated that we can't do what our big church friends do, which is just hire the people who are way on the regular team, those who have already been trained to oversee various church ministries and departments. Instead, we have to train these people as they go, and even when they get good at doing the ministry, they're usually squeezing those responsibilities in between their jobs, between raising kids, and the other events of a busy life outside the church, and we wish we could just hire someone to do it full time. Well, I get the frustrations, but I think it's really important for us to stop seeing this as a negative and to start seeing it as the discipleship opportunity that it can be. In a small church, we're not just hiring people to perform a task. We're using this as an opportunity to help them become better servants of Christ and His church. And if we, as church leaders, can have that change of mind and heart from a pursuit of technical excellence by hiring people who are trained to do it already to the opportunity to disciple people, this changes everything. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.